So then comes the first question, and this is so true, the question of suffering. And he's going to say, we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. So that when we are, well, he hasn't talked about suffering yet, forgive me for that, but he's coming to this point where he's saying, look, as we abide in this peace, not that it's being taken from us, but we continue to enjoy it. And then as we abide in this grace, not that it's being taken from us, but we continue to enjoy it. That when we're doing these things, we're also walking and we're rejoicing or literally boasting in the hope that God gets glory. Now, glory, again, it can be kind of this weird nebulous thing. Literally here, it means good opinion. In the Old Testament, it has the idea of weightiness, the weight, the glory of God. They couldn't go into the temple because his glory was there, the weightiness of God. And so it's being communicated here is he's saying, look, because of who God is, we actually have a hope, which, again, it's not desire. We use the word hope all the time as desire. I hope I get this job. I hope I go to this school. I hope I whatever. I hope I get married someday. I hope I get out of this marriage. I mean, all the things that the different hopes that we have, that's not biblical hope. Biblical hope is expectation. So it's really important. So when we read hope as Christians, we're not saying, oh gosh, I hope I get into heaven someday. Like, ooh, maybe if, old Peter's up there with the scales. No. As the Christian, we say, I expect to go to heaven. I expect it. Not because of me, not because I'm righteous, I expect that. So he says that we have an expectation that we can walk in, and it's the expectation of God getting glory. Now, we know from a lot of other instances, other verses, that God will share his glory, not his Shekinah glory as God, his essence, but that we will share some sort of weightiness or good opinion with him. Not to say we'll become famous and people will see us in heaven and be like, oh, wow, you're really great. Not that at all. But that we'll get to share in that amazing weightiness of God. When you read about his description in Revelation, whether it's his incredible throne or the description of the Lord Jesus with the eyes of fire and the tongue like a sword, these different things that we read about. That we'll be with him and share in that glory in some way. Having that being said, there's a great verse, I think, that really illustrates this and the thought that we're coming into. If you wouldn't mind turning to 2 Corinthians. Excuse me. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul talking a lot in 2 Corinthians about suffering, in chapter 4 about suffering, about ministry suffering for Christ, dying to ourselves so that Christ's life may shine out of us. And he concludes it by saying this, verse 16, 2 Corinthians 4:16. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light and momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. As we look not at the things that are seen, but at the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. And obviously there's a ton to talk about there, a ton to unpack there, and we're not going to do that today. But just to illustrate this point that we're about to enter into and that Paul's been talking about, there is suffering in following Jesus. And it really comes down to what happens in that suffering, it comes down to what we're looking at. Because everything that is seen is temporal, he says. And that's, to me, it's a very freeing thought. The only thing that you've seen today, or yesterday, or the day before that, or tomorrow, that will last is the soul of the people you've seen. That's it. That is the only thing on this planet. God says eventually he'll wad it up like an old garment and chuck it into a fire. The only eternal thing here is us and our souls. And if we're focusing on all the things that are seen, if our focus of our life is politics or it's money or it's any of these things that are important, they have a place, but they don't last, and they will not last. And so he says that how we look at things and what we're looking at will actually determine what happens in our suffering. And he says when we're honest about it, when we're looking at the things that are unseen, the eternal things, that is working for us an eternal way of glory. Now, I don't know what that means, but it doesn't sound bad. It doesn't sound like something you're going to get up there and be like, oh, dang it, an eternal weight of glory. I was hoping for like a Porsche or something. It's going to be amazing. Some sort of shared communion with Christ, this sharing in that amazed awe and awesomeness of who he is, being able to talk about the experiences of our lives and to confess, yeah, you were always faithful. You always took care of me. Because the amazing thing, if you wouldn't mind, flip back to Romans chapter 5. The amazing thing about suffering is that you and I are the only people that will determine what it does to us in our lives. Our parents won't determine that. Our siblings won't determine that. Our friends won't determine that. Our Facebook account won't determine that. Only you and I can determine what suffering does for us. Because he promises that he can make it work for good. And that's what Paul's talking about here. That's why he's saying, he begins addressing suffering by saying, let us be at peace. You have the peace, it's yours, embrace it. Let us be in grace. You have the grace, it's yours, embrace it, walk in it. And now he's going to talk about the suffering. He says, knowing that suffering, verse 3, not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces, and we'll stop there. The first thing he says about suffering is you can know something. It produces something in you. Now, this is where we come in. Because many of us have had, probably all of us, have had opportunities to suffer for whatever reason. Whether we suffer because somebody else caused suffering in our life, whether we suffer because just natural, unfortunate circumstances cause suffering in our lives, whatever it might be, whether it's nature or the economy or whatever it could be, we've probably all experienced suffering. And all of us, I'd be willing to bet, if we went around the room and we polled everyone, probably had a time in our life where we were suffering and we blamed God. And even though it's human beings that, snub and insult and destroy one another, even though it's human beings that do things that cause cancer, that do things that, whatever, even though it's human beings that assault and are assaulted, even though it's human beings that pretty much cause every single evil on the planet, as soon as something bad happens to us, we go, you did this. You let this happen. This is your fault. Never mind the fact that we have like 10,000 years of history of man screwing things up. This one's your fault. You did this to me. You ever felt that way before? I think probably most of us have, at least in a moment. And when we feel that way, it's interesting because when we feel that way and we acknowledge it and walk in it, and this is the crux of discipleship and Christianity. What do you acknowledge and what do you walk in? That's what decides your entire day. It's what decides your moment. It decides what's going to happen to you. It decides what fruit's going to come out of you. It's going to decide what your family's going to be like, what your kids are going to be like, what your church is going to be like, what your job is going to be like. Every single thing in your life depends on what do you acknowledge and what do you walk in. Our own sufferings are our own fault. Paul said, let's be in God's peace. So when the bank account's empty, what do? This is your fault, God. Never mind, I just messed around my entire high school career. You should have given me a better job. You should have done this. You should have done that. It's your fault, the economy, and I'm poor now. Or do we say, okay, here's where I'm at with my finances. It's not a good place. Lord, can you help me? Or will you provide for me? Right? One is panic and wrath, and one is faith, peace, and grace. And so in every relationship, in every contact, in every dilemma we have, Paul is saying suffering can reap something in you, but we have to stay and acknowledge and walk in God's peace, that he's not at war with us. He didn't try to get us. He's not against us. He's working for us, and his grace, that he favors us. That he says, like of Israel, you're the apple of my eye. If anybody touches you, it's like they're poking me in the eye. The fact that we have this promise, this love letter, because that will ultimately determine how we receive suffering. It'll determine how we walk in our relationships and all of that.